Hey everyone, my name is Dak. Welcome to my channel. I am retelling stories from the Bible in the best way I know how for you. If you're inspired by stories of faith, love, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe as it helps out a bunch. Thank you, and above all glory is to God. What if the very things you avoid, pain, weakness, and struggle, are where God says you'll find true happiness? That's not how most people define a good life. When on a quiet mountainside in Galilee, Jesus began his greatest message by turning those ideas upside down. He called the broken, the mournful, and the peacemakers blessed. Why? Because in his kingdom, blessing grows from the inside out. If that sounds hard to grasp, stay with me. We'll walk this mountain path together. In a moment, we'll begin at the first beatitude, but first, picture the hillside with me. The mountain that changed everything. Why would Jesus begin his most important teaching on a hillside rather than in the temple courts or a royal palace? Most leaders who wanted to shape a nation went straight to centers of power. Yet the Sermon on the Mount unfolded far from Jerusalem's grand halls, on a stretch of earth open to farmers, fishermen, and families. That choice was intentional. It set the stage for a message that would redefine what authority looked like. Not distant, heavy with status, but close at hand, shared among ordinary people. The mountain itself carries meaning. In Jewish memory, mountains were more than scenery. They were meeting places between God and humanity. Abraham on Mount Moriah, Elijah on Mount Carmel, and most famously Moses on Sinai. In fact, when Matthew describes Jesus going up the mountain to teach, it recalls the scene of Sinai where God gave the law. Matthew intentionally echoes that tradition, showing Jesus as the one who now reveals God's way of life for his people. But unlike Sinai, with fire, cloud, and trembling fear, Galilee's hillside was open and calm. There was no barrier keeping people at a distance. Here everyone could draw near, listen, and be part of the moment. The way Jesus positioned himself added to the message. He didn't stand like a ruler demanding attention. He sat, as teachers of that time often did, signaling both authority and invitation. Seated among them, his posture told the crowd this was not performance or display, it was relationship. God's word was coming near, not as thunder and flame, but through the steady presence of a man speaking face to face with those who most needed hope. The crowd carried many kinds of expectations. Some likely longed for freedom from Roman oppression. Others hoped for justice in daily life or relief from the constant struggle to survive. Many came with wounds, from heavy taxes, from neglect by leaders, or from weariness in daily labor. People were waiting for a Messiah who would restore dignity and strength to Israel. But the first words they heard moved in the surprising direction. Instead of rousing speeches about taking power, Jesus began to bless those who seemed least likely to be favored. The poor, the grieving, the meek. Some in the crowd likely hoped for deliverance in outward forms, but Jesus pointed first to inward renewal. That shift would have sounded startling, even unsettling. And yet it fit the setting. By stepping onto an ordinary mountain instead of standing in a palace or temple, Jesus revealed the kind of kingdom he was announcing. It would not flow from political systems, wealthy families, or official offices. It would grow from within, starting in hearts that knew their need for God. His authority did not rest on social titles, but on truth centered in mercy and humility. The mountain became the visible reminder. The kingdom is accessible, wide open to anyone willing to listen. No guards kept the crowds away, no gates required a payment to enter. Whoever came up the hillside could sit within earshot of the teacher's voice. Think of the quiet strength in that. Jesus of Nazareth, known for his humble background, spoke with a kind of authority people had rarely seen. He wasn't a scholar from Rome or a priest from Jerusalem's elite circles, but his words carried a weight that reached across class and age. Simply by choosing that setting, he was saying something that went deeper than geography. God's kingdom would not mirror human hierarchies, it would spread among the overlooked and underestimated. The mountain also tied the past to the present. Sinai gave Israel its covenant law through Moses, shaping the life of the nation. Now, on this Galilean mountainside, Jesus was offering a new framework for life in God's kingdom. The echo connects them, but the difference is equally important. Sinai was marked by awe and distance. This mountain was marked by closeness and invitation. Sinai formed a people through commands written on stone. Galilee invited hearts to be reshaped from within. The contrast makes his message even clearer. God's authority clothes itself in humility. Power takes the form of presence and compassion. Consider what this meant for those listening. They were used to thinking of God's nearness as tied to holy places that only a few could enter, the temple courts, the inner sanctuaries. But here was a new picture. Sitting on open ground, Jesus embodied the truth that God meets us not only in sacred buildings but in everyday spaces. The mountain became a symbol of access, of God's willingness to meet people in the ordinary. That shift was revolutionary in itself. It's worth pausing to notice how this fits into the broader story of Scripture. Throughout the Bible, mountain moments turn the page in history. Abraham's willingness on Moriah, Elijah's confrontation on Carmel, Moses on Sinai, each revealed something new about God and his people's direction. Placing Jesus' greatest teaching on a mountain signals another turning point. The law of Moses had given structure to Israel. Now Jesus gives shape to life in his kingdom. Different in detail, but the same in weight. Both mark decisive revelations of how God calls his people to live. The people listening that day sat caught between hope and uncertainty. They needed guidance, but not in the form they expected. Many probably came longing for solutions outside themselves, relief from Roman power, an easier path through economic struggle. But Jesus began by pointing to what happens inside a person, because that is where the kingdom takes root. His first words called them to humility, to recognize need before God. Instead of strength and control, he started with surrender. By placing this message on an accessible hillside, Jesus was already living out its meaning. Authority cloaked in humility, power without pretense, invitation in place of exclusion. This was not only a different sermon, it was a different kingdom altogether. And it began not with grandeur, but with the willingness of simple people to sit and listen. So before the first beatitude was ever spoken, the setting itself was teaching. A mountain that echoed Sinai, yet offered a gentler, nearer invitation. A teacher who spoke with authority, yet in humility. A crowd expecting freedom from above, and instead hearing a call to transformation from within. This was, in every way, a mountain that changed everything. And when Jesus finally opened his mouth, he began with a blessing that turned all common sense upside down. The very first step was not wealth, strength, or achievement. It was need, poverty of spirit. If the first blessing begins with admitting need, what does that look like? We'll start there. The first step, poor in spirit. The words that came first on that hillside were simple and direct. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. With these words, Jesus set the tone for everything that would follow. Being poor in spirit does not point to those without financial resources, but to those who recognize their deepest dependence on God. Matthew's wording matters here. While Luke's gospel uses, "Blessed are you who are poor," Matthew adds the phrase, "in spirit," making it clear this blessing applies not only to the materially poor, but to anyone who knows they cannot rely on themselves and must look to God. This is not about failure or worthlessness. It is about opening your hands and admitting that life cannot be held together by your own strength. And Jesus says blessing begins in that place of honesty. For the crowd listening, that opening line must have felt both startling and strangely hopeful. Many worked long hours under Roman taxes, struggling to provide even the basics for their families. They knew the fatigue of survival, and they carried generations of longing for deliverance. To them, the idea that God's kingdom would begin with spiritual poverty may have sounded unsettling, because poverty was never celebrated. Yet it also sounded inviting, because so many already felt overlooked and powerless. Jesus was not rejecting them for this. He was saying that the very place they felt most unqualified was the place God's kingdom would meet them. We live in a world where weakness is often hidden or dismissed. From a young age, the message is clear. Stand tall, stay in control, prove that you are capable. Strength means independence, and dependence looks like weakness. But in his first beatitude, Jesus blesses what most despise. He honors the one who admits, "I cannot do this alone." He says the doorway into God's kingdom is humble enough that you have to stoop down to enter. That's why the proud find it so hard to step through, but the weary, the fragile, and the honest find themselves welcomed. It is rare for anyone to be completely open about need. Ask people how they are, and the answer is usually, "I'm fine," even if it is far from true. Beneath the surface there is often fear, discouragement, or exhaustion. To be poor in spirit is to set aside the mask and be honest before God. It is not about keeping up appearances or pretending to have everything handled. It is about admitting, "God, I do not have enough in myself. I need you." That moment of truth is where blessing begins, because it creates the space God alone can fill. Sometimes the fear of admitting weakness feels heavier than the weakness itself. Imagine a person working tirelessly to prove themselves, keeping up every appearance of control but secretly collapsing inside. Then, one day, the pressure becomes too much. Defenses break. They finally speak the words they had concealed. "I cannot keep this up." That single admission, far from being defeat, becomes a release. Help enters, comfort is offered, and suddenly what once felt shameful becomes the first step towards freedom. This is what poverty of spirit looks like, choosing honesty over image so that God's grace has room to act. At its heart, poverty of spirit is not about being useless or empty of value. It is about clear vision. It's the recognition that no human effort, no achievement or performance can fix what is most broken inside. God does not disdain those moments of clarity. He welcomes them. The instant pride and pretense fall, His grace can do its deepest work. Weakness is not the end of the story. It becomes the opening through which God enters. Think about it like soil waiting for rain. Dry ground cannot form water on its own. It looks barren, even lifeless. But when the skies open, the soil drinks deeply and life stirs within it. Being poor in spirit is like that, choosing to stay open and ready to receive, aware that what you need cannot come from yourself. And notice what Jesus promises. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not merely, someday they will see it, but right now, the kingdom belongs to them. Dependence does not move you onto God's waiting list. It opens a present reality, where His care, His rule, and His presence are already yours. It makes sense. If you believe you already carry everything within you, if you are convinced that you are fully self-sufficient, then why would you lean on God? You might respect Him at a distance, borrow His teachings when they are convenient, but true reliance would never take root. On the other hand, when you understand the limits of your own strength, you are ready to draw from a resource beyond yourself. You are prepared to live where God is not a concept, but a real presence. This is why poverty of spirit is the first door to blessing. It clears away illusions so that God Himself can step in. There is also another challenge woven into this beatitude. Many at the time assumed that closeness to God meant purity of ritual, public displays of devotion, and the right religious performance. Appear impressive, say the right phrases, and you might find favor. But Jesus reverses this assumption. It is not the polished or the powerful who are named blessed, it is those who simply admit need. The kingdom is not closed to the ordinary or the unqualified. Instead, it is wide open at the level of humility. This first beatitude does more than open the door, it lays the foundation. Every other blessing builds on this one. To mourn properly, you first need the honesty of spirit that bows low. To grow in meekness, you first need to lay down pride. To hunger and thirst for righteousness, you must come empty-handed. Every step in the list begins with the same starting move. Admit need, embrace humility, and discover strength from God. If this foundation is ignored, the rest cannot hold. But once it is set, the whole structure of kingdom life can rise. You might think admitting need sounds small, almost too small to be the entry point of God's kingdom. But consider friendships or marriages. Without honesty, without confessing weakness or limitation, real connection never takes root. Hiding may feel easier, but it blocks closeness. By contrast, sharing need invites intimacy. With God, the same principle holds. Pride leads only to isolation. poverty of spirit draws you near. And look again at what follows immediately after the blessing. Jesus doesn't leave it vague. He names the outcome, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is not a hollow encouragement. It is an active promise. Your weakness becomes the very place God's reign and presence fills. Dependence is not loss, it is inheritance. Recognizing need does not end your story, it begins a new one. It is no surprise, then, that Jesus chose this as the first step. Had he begun with strength or power, the broken might have left believing the kingdom did not belong to them. But he said the opposite. In humility, in openness, the door swings wide. For those gathered on the hillside that day, this was truly good news. For many, perhaps tears formed as they realized God's blessing could rest on them, not because they were strong, but precisely because they were weak. That same promise holds steady today. Ending where we began, the first step of kingdom life is surrender, not achievement. True greatness in God's economy begins not at the top, but at the bottom, when you realize you are not enough on your own. Treasure is not taken, it is given. Grace is not earned, it is received. And that pattern will mark all the steps to come. So let me leave you with this question. Where in your own life do you feel weak enough to finally ask for help? That place, uncomfortable as it feels, may be the very doorway into God's blessing. And as we continue, notice where Jesus takes us next. After opening with need, he turns to one of the hardest realities of life, sorrow itself. What could it mean for grief, of all things, to be called blessed? Mourning that leads to comfort. Jesus' second blessing points us to something most people try to avoid, mourning. He says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." At first glance, it feels backward. We don't usually call grief a gift, but Jesus did, because he knew that mourning, when brought honestly before God, opens the heart to receive what nothing else can give, his comfort. This echoes Isaiah's promise that God would comfort those who mourn, assuring his people that sorrow would not be the final word. It's important to see that mourning here is broader than sadness alone. It includes grief over personal loss, yes, but it also looks at the brokenness in our own lives and in the world. To mourn is to stop pretending that everything is fine. It's to face pain without disguise, whether that pain comes from sin, injustice, or loss. Instead of numbing it with distractions or denying it with forced smiles, Jesus calls this honesty blessed. We live in a culture that encourages the opposite: cover over grief, busy yourself, stay strong, and move on quickly. Phrases like "time heals all wounds" or "don't dwell on it" surround us, even though time by itself doesn't heal much at all. Often those words simply signal that others are uncomfortable with sorrow. Yet mourning, in the way Jesus meant it, isn't weakness, it's courage. It's opening raw places of the soul where God can enter with his presence. And that's the heart of this beatitude. The comfort Matthew and Isaiah point to is God's presence with the suffering, not always an immediate end to pain. Grief doesn't evaporate just because you pray. Tears don't stop falling overnight. But in the space of genuine mourning, something deeper happens. God steps close. Comfort here means more than soothing words. It's the Spirit of God filling the aching silence with himself. Consider this common, anonymous example. A family loses someone dear much too soon. The pain feels crushing, prayers are hard to voice, and answers don't come. Friends come and sit nearby, not with speeches, but with quiet presence. In time, the family begins to describe a strange reality. Even though their grief still aches, they feel held in a way they cannot explain. That is how comfort takes shape, not by erasing the wound, but by meeting them in it so they are not alone. Or consider another common example. A person who has ignored personal struggles for years finally collapses under the weight of guilt. They can no longer laugh it off or shift the blame. For the first time they mourn, not only what they have lost, but the separation their choices created between them and God. And it's there, in the tears, that they begin to feel God's mercy is real, his nearness unmistakable. Their sorrow becomes the very crack where light enters. These examples reveal that mourning is not just about hard events, it is a posture of honesty. It is admitting what is wrong in us and around us instead of covering it up. God blesses that space because only there can His comfort land. The world tells us to numb pain away. Jesus instead urges us to face it with open eyes, believe His promise, and invite God into what hurts most. Think of a child who falls and scrapes a knee. The pain is sharp and tears flow. The wound doesn't disappear when a parent scoops the child into their arms. Yet everything changes. The presence of love reframes the pain, giving it a different weight. That picture captures something of this beatitude. The pain may remain, but God's presence steps into it, reshaping despair into trust and grief into holy ground. It's important to note that Jesus is not glorifying sadness itself. He is not saying we should seek sorrow or wear grief like a badge. Mourning is not valuable because it is dark, but because it is honest. It reveals truth about the world and truth about ourselves. The blessing lies in refusing denial and allowing God to meet us in that raw openness. And that meeting with God brings many forms of comfort. Sometimes it arrives as unexplainable peace right in the middle of tears. Other times it looks like strength to take the next step when you feel too heavy to move at all. Often it comes through others who embody God's care, friends who listen, a community that holds a grieving family, even a stranger's quiet kindness. The shapes of comfort vary, but at the heart is always the same reality. God is close. This truth has wide reach. Every person, at some stage, will stand in mourning. It may be after losing someone dear, after realizing a mistake you cannot undo, after facing injustice, or after disappointment takes away what you'd hoped. Mourning is not the exception, it's part of life's path. Jesus' promise tells us that such moments are not signs of failure or rejection. They are moments when God promises to draw near. That perspective reshapes how we approach sorrow in daily life. Instead of dreading it or disguising it, we can let it lead us toward God's embrace. Tears are not wasted in His kingdom. Each sigh, each lament, each moment where the world feels too heavy can become prayer. Mourning can be transformed from an ending into a beginning, not by our strength, but by God's nearness. It also changes how we respond to others in grief. If mourners are already blessed by God's presence, then our role is not to rush them past their sorrow, but to honor it. Offering comfort is less about polished words and more about faithful presence. Sitting quietly, listening without judgment, or simply showing up can become the very place where God's promise comes to life through us. When we do this, we act as vessels of His comfort. That is why Jesus could say with certainty, "Blessed are those who mourn." Mourning opens the door to God's promise. It creates room for His Spirit to make a home where humans reach their limit. It guards against shallow living, teaching us to face life as it is, yet trust God as He is. And comfort, real comfort, arrives not as a quick fix, but as presence strong enough to sustain even the heaviest grief. Imagine the hillside crowd hearing this. Many of them carry deep personal sorrows, the ache of poverty, the sting of injustice, the pain of family loss. To their ears this wasn't theory, it was hope. For the first time someone was telling them their tears were not shameful but blessed. They were not outside God's care but at its very center. His kingdom wasn't for the unbroken and polished. It was open to the grieving and fragile, with comfort promised to them directly. So mourning in the kingdom is not hopelessness, it is grief entrusted to God, and this difference changes everything. Instead of being crushed by sorrow, you are accompanied in it. Instead of carrying it in isolation, you share it with the one who binds up the brokenhearted. In fact, mourning becomes the very field where seeds of hope are planted, hope that God will restore, even if not all at once. And so the ground beneath our tears becomes surprisingly firm. Mourning does not mean despair because God joins the mourners. His comfort is as certain as his promise was through Isaiah, as near as his spirit is today. What loss are you carrying that feels like a closed door? Bring it here in the comments if you'd like, because if mourning can hold blessing, then perhaps we also need to rethink what makes for true strength. Maybe there is a kind of strength not found in grasping power but in laying it down, a strength the world easily overlooks. Meekness that I bid the earth. What if the quiet strength of meekness can outlast all force? It doesn't sound likely in a world where louder voices, stronger fists, and bigger titles seem to win. But that's exactly what Jesus says in his words on the mountainside. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. To understand this, we have to see meekness not as weakness or shyness, but as strength under control. The word used in the original language, praus, describes someone who has the ability to act with power yet chooses restraint. It's a picture of a wild horse that has been trained, not made weak but made useful, steady, and directed with purpose. Most of us have been taught to admire those who push their way forward. Society often connects success with being assertive, outspoken, or demanding. We see it in boardrooms, classrooms, and even in daily life. Winning is associated with showing dominance and never backing down. But Jesus turns that viewpoint inside out. He lifts up meekness, a quality many people assume as passive or timid, as the very trait that will hold lasting influence. It isn't about standing in the spotlight, it's about being steady enough to let God's hand guide your strength rather than using it to crush others. Think for a moment about how different meekness is from what usually gets noticed. Someone who is meek may not draw attention first. They may stay quiet when others argue. They may be overlooked because they don't play power games. But over time, meekness plants roots that grow deeper than force ever does. The aggressive rise and fall, but the meek are able to endure with a calm that others long for. You may have seen this in your own life, not in headlines but in ordinary spaces. A parent who responds with patience instead of shouting, a leader who listens instead of dominating, a friend who chooses forgiveness over revenge. These quiet choices shape relationships and sometimes entire communities. Let me share a story. Years ago, a teacher worked with a class of students that included one boy who constantly tested her patience. He interrupted lessons, disrupted classmates, and pushed limits every day. Many in her position would have answered with harsh words or constant punishment. Instead, she decided to show restraint. She continued to set boundaries, but she offered encouragement each time he made even a small step in the right direction. Over time, the boy responded. By the end of the year, his behavior had turned, and he later credited that teacher with changing how he saw himself. Her meekness, her choice not to crush his spirit, even though she held authority, shaped his future. That is what meekness looks like. It's not about lack of strength, it's about strength that chooses the path of patience and gentleness. Jesus' words carry both comfort and challenge. When he promises that the meek will inherit the earth, he does not mean those who scramble for control of land or power. He is speaking about those who belong to his kingdom. In the Psalms, we read similar words about inheriting the land. At first, it referred to the promised land of Israel, but here Jesus expands the vision. The inheritance of the meek is not only about soil, but about sharing in the fullness of God's kingdom, life with him both now and forever. In other words, it is not the ones who dominate today who will own tomorrow. It is those who live with quiet trust. This is counter to everything culture teaches us about worth. Being meek, by Jesus' definition, means you know who you are in God's eyes. Since your identity rests in his love, you don't need to spend your days proving, competing, or tearing others down to secure a place for yourself. Because your value is assured, you're able to use your strength in ways that bring life instead of harm. You can stand up for others because you already know God has stood up for you. You can resist the pull to fight every battle because you trust God to handle what you cannot. That is deep security, one that force can never create. Let's pause and compare this picture of meekness to how humility is viewed today. In many places, humility gets mistaken for low self-esteem, a lack of drive, or being easy to push around. Yet biblical meekness doesn't mean being trampled or silent when truth should be spoken. It doesn't mean refusing to act in hard moments. Instead, it means the opposite, having the courage and strength, but choosing to wield it in ways that fit God's heart. The meek are free from the pride that tries to win every argument. They are free from the fear that tries to grab more than what is theirs. Their freedom rests on trust in God's justice, not on their own ability to control every outcome. Think about the difference this kind of meekness makes in relationships. When people fight only to win, resentment grows, trust erodes. But when someone demonstrates meekness, steady strength that listens, restrains anger, and waits on God, then healing becomes possible. Marriages last longer, friendships deepen, and communities hold together when meekness takes root. You may know somebody who lives this way. When conflict rises, they do not rush to retaliate, they keep calm. At first, it may look like weakness to others, but over time you realize their calm is actually a rare kind of power, the kind that prevents cycles of escalation. One of the most striking things is that Jesus does not say the powerful will inherit what matters. He doesn't even say the talented or the clever will hold the world in the end. He says the meek will. That is breathtaking. It replaces ladders of ambition with a different picture, that the earth itself is promised to those who let God be their defender. And if that is true, then the fight to prove yourself becomes exhausting for no reason. The quiet ones, trusting God's justice, are actually standing on the winning side already. Notice something here. Meekness is not natural for most of us. Our instincts pull us towards self-protection and control. If someone insults us, we want to answer sharply. If someone challenges us, we want the last word. If life feels unfair, we want to push harder and make sure people see our effort. Yet Jesus calls us not to live by that reflex, but to learn a new way, His way. He calls us to surrender the impulse to dominate and instead walk humbly with confidence in God's timing. I once heard someone say meekness is like holding a sword but choosing carefully when and how to use it. The power is still there, the ability is real, but the meek refuse to swing wildly. They let God dictate the purpose, and by doing so they prevent the destruction that unfocused power causes. In daily life that might look like staying silent when words would fuel division, or waiting patiently while trusting God's timing, or forgiving someone instead of plotting revenge. Each example reflects a choice to trust God's way over your own urge for control. The truth is, meek people are not pushovers. They can actually be some of the strongest people you'll ever meet. They stand firm in storms, not because they shout louder, but because their roots are deep. Their strength has been surrendered to God, and that makes it unshakable. You can see why Jesus would call this blessed. A meek heart not only inherits God's promises in the future, but brings light and peace into the present. The world may not applaud it, but it notices when someone lives this way. People are drawn to quiet strength. This blessing also carries hope for us. Maybe you've been tempted to believe that unless you fight tooth and nail for every inch, you'll end up with nothing. Maybe you've thought that kindness, patience, or gentleness will only get you walked on. Jesus answers with the opposite. Those who live meekly are not losing, they are inheriting. They will hold what matters because God Himself secures it for them. That means you can lay down battles that were never yours to fight and rest in His promise. So when He says, "Blessed are the meek," He is inviting us into a different rhythm of life. It's one where you trust that God's justice will outlast human agendas. It's one where your worth is not measured by applause or positions or victories, but by God's approval and care. And it's one where you discover that real strength is not seen in who you can overpower, but in who you can serve without fear. Take a moment and imagine the people on that hillside. Many of them carried wounds from Roman soldiers, from leaders who looked down on them, from systems that did not value their lives. They did not feel powerful. They likely wondered if they even mattered. Yet Jesus looked at them and said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Can you feel what that must have meant? The world told them they were unimportant, but God's Son told them they were the ones who would hold the truest inheritance. That promise stands for us as well. You don't have to claw your way up the ladder to find God's blessing. You don't have to win every argument or defeat every rival to hold what matters. The invitation today is the same as it was on that mountain. Be meek. Trust that God's hands are strong enough to carry you and that His justice is sure enough to set things right. At the end of the day, meekness frees you. You don't waste your life battling enemies that God already intends to overcome. You don't limit your joy to positions you can grab or possessions you can lose. Instead, you step into the wide promise of God's kingdom, knowing your inheritance is secure. Jesus' words still ring true. The meek will inherit the earth. And this blessing prepares us to look ahead at the next surprise. Because if meekness brings strength and inheritance, what about hunger? What happens when your soul longs for what is right and good with the same intensity that the body longs for food? Hunger for what truly satisfies. Why would hunger ever be pictured as good, and how could it be filling? Hunger in our everyday lives usually means something is missing. It means you are weak, tired, or even desperate. No one chooses to feel hungry. It drives you to search and keeps you restless until the need is met. Yet Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." These words pull us into a spiritual kind of hunger. It is not about food, but about longing for God's way to become real, in our lives, in our communities, and in the world. This kind of hunger does not leave you empty in the end. Jesus promises it will lead to being filled. Let's take a moment to reflect on what righteousness means here. It is not a cold word about rules or trying to seem perfect. Righteousness in this teaching speaks about rightness with God and the world around us. It is about things being what they are meant to be: justice instead of oppression, mercy instead of cruelty, trust instead of betrayal. Hunger for righteousness is the ache you feel when you see that life is not fair, when you notice wounds that need healing, or when you realize your own heart is not the way God intended it to be. It is a restless longing, a cry deep inside that says, "God, make things right." Food can fill you for a little while, but after only a few hours hunger returns. That is why so many people spend life running after satisfactions that never last. A new possession, an achievement, or a success may seem to quiet the ache in the moment, but soon it is back. Soul hunger is different. It cannot be fed with temporary pleasures. Have you ever felt that? That after all you worked for, after you finally reached something you wanted, there was still a deeper emptiness inside? That is the hunger Jesus is naming, the hunger that nothing in this world can fully quench except the goodness of God Himself. Think of it like thirst for clean water in desert heat. If you have ever been outside on a hot day where every step feels heavy and your tongue feels dry, then you know a drink of cold water is not just pleasant, it is life. Imagine walking for miles under that sun with no shade and no water in sight. Relief does not come from anything else, not from wealth, not from power, not even from entertainment. You want one thing: water. That is what hunger and thirst for righteousness means. It is a desperate, deep need for God's justice and goodness to come, the way water comes into dry ground. And just as water brings strength and life, Jesus promises this longing will not stay empty. Now here is something important. Hunger for righteousness is not meant to make you miserable. God does not bless pain for the sake of pain. This hunger is a sign that your heart is alive, that you care about what matters to Him. People who feel the ache for righteousness see what is wrong and cannot ignore it. They long for the broken to be healed, the needy to be cared for, the world to reflect the heart of its Creator. Far from being hopeless, this hunger is the very thing that connects you to God's own desires. It is like carrying His heartbeat inside you. History gives us examples of what this looks like. Think about people who gave their lives to serve those in need. Some opened homes for children who had no families. Others worked to change unjust systems that crushed the poor. They did not do these things to look important. They did them because they felt the hunger for righteousness and could not stay still. Think of those who visited prisons, fed the hungry, or stood beside the oppressed. each of them acting because inside they longed for God's world to reflect His goodness. Many times they discovered deep joy in that work, even when it cost them comfort or safety. That joy came because God was feeding their hunger with His presence and His purpose. Let's bring it closer to daily life. Maybe you are not changing laws or building hospitals. Still, you know what it feels like to ache for what is right. You may pray for a family member who struggles, asking God to set them free. You may notice a friend who is lonely and choose to sit beside them. That choice is an answer to the hunger for righteousness. It says, God, I want things to be right for this person. And in the process of serving or caring, you often find a strange satisfaction rising up in you, a sense that this is the kind of life we were made to live. That is God fulfilling His promise. Those who hunger for righteousness will be filled. Sometimes the filling looks like inner peace, knowing God hears your cries for justice even when results seem far away. Other times it comes in visible changes, seeing a broken relationship mended, or watching mercy soften someone's heart. There are moments when longing itself feels heavy, but Jesus assures us it will never be wasted. Every ounce of desire for His goodness is met by His presence and His promise. He will fill, not just later in eternity, but also now, in ways that give courage and hope. It is worth noticing that Jesus does not say, "Blessed are those who occasionally think about righteousness." He speaks of hunger and thirst, words that carry urgency. Hunger demands attention. Thirst makes you stop everything until the need is met. This is no casual interest. It is a craving strong enough to shape choices. And that's the invitation. Do we long for righteousness in the same way we long for food and drink when our stomachs ache and our throats are dry? That depth of desire is the mark of those God calls blessed. Hunger for what truly satisfies is also a reminder of what cannot satisfy. When we try to replace this longing with empty substitutes, we may feel busy or distracted, but the emptiness lingers. Some chase wealth, some chase applause, some chase pleasure, hoping it will fill the ache. Yet the hunger for righteousness can only be answered by God Himself. It is as if our hearts are designed with a space that fits nothing else, and the promise of Jesus stands firm. If you seek this, you will be satisfied. Let's think again about the people who sat on that hillside listening. Many were poor. Some were treated unfairly by tax collectors or soldiers. Others carried guilt or shame. When Jesus spoke these words, He spoke into souls already aching. To them, hunger was not an abstract metaphor, it was a real, daily experience. And He took that lived reality and said, "Yes, just as you long for bread and water, long for righteousness, the same ache you feel for food, carry it toward God's way. And just as food nourishes, my Father will fill you." Imagine the hope that stirred in them as they heard this. Their real hunger became a doorway into the promise of God's blessing. So where does that leave us? This beatitude challenges us to pay attention to our desires. What is it that fills your hunger? What do you chase in order to feel satisfied? If the answer is anything less than God's righteousness, it will last only for a moment. But if the hunger of your heart matches His heart, the promise guarantees fullness. You will not be left empty. God binds Himself to the filling of this hunger. What happens when you give mercy to people who don't deserve it? That question touches something deep inside each of us, because if we're honest, our first reaction is usually not mercy. When someone hurts us, our instinct is to protect ourselves or even strike back. When words are spoken against us, when trust is broken, or when unfair decisions are made, mercy does not feel natural. But Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." These words describe not only what God values, but also the way His kingdom works. Mercy is not weakness. It is a deliberate choice that interrupts cycles of revenge, bitterness, and endless retaliation. Think of how cycles usually work in real life. Someone insults another person, the insult is returned, and the tension only grows. A hurt left untreated hardens into resentment. Over time, resentment grows into bitterness. Before long, relationships that once held love and friendship are full of distance. Mercy cuts directly against this pattern. To choose mercy is to choose a new path. It means responding not with what someone deserves, but with grace that recognizes your own need for grace too. This doesn't mean ignoring pain or pretending wrong didn't happen. Mercy does not erase justice. What it does is refuse to let anger and retaliation have the final word. It creates room for God's presence to bring healing instead of destruction. When Jesus connects mercy to the promise of receiving mercy yourself, he is teaching us about the way hearts are softened when kindness is extended. When you show mercy, you open yourself to experience God's mercy in fresh ways. I once heard the story of a man who had carried bitterness for years toward his father. His father had left when he was young and had not been present through important parts of his life. As he grew older, the resentment stayed. He felt justified in his anger. By all accounts, he had every reason to hold it. One day, struggling with his own failings as a parent, he realized something. He too needed mercy. In that moment, he called his father, not to accuse him, but to offer forgiveness. At first, the conversation was quiet and awkward, but over time, walls began to fall. Healing came not because the past was changed, but because mercy was given. That mercy broke a cycle passed down through generations. What had been anger turned into connection. That kind of transformation reveals why Jesus calls the merciful blessed. Let's take a moment to reflect on the weight of his words. He does not describe mercy as an optional part of life in God's kingdom. He presents it as a core quality, tied directly to how we relate to him. As we read in Scripture, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." That means mercy is both given and received. It is both an outward action and an inward gift. To withhold mercy from others is to close the door on receiving it. But to give mercy is to open your life wide to God's compassion. Think about what this means for everyday life. Maybe a friend betrayed your trust by repeating something you shared. Your reflex is to distance yourself or to expose them in return. Mercy means choosing to forgive, not because they earned it, but because you know what it is to be forgiven yourself. Maybe someone at work constantly tries to make you look bad. The easy response would be to undermine them in return. Mercy means laying down retaliation and seeking peace instead. This does not excuse wrong behavior, but it shifts your response from mirroring hurt to showing kindness. And in that shift, God's kingdom shines through. This reminds us that giving grace creates room for God's grace to flow in our lives. Mercy does not lock you in bitterness, it opens you up to live lighter. When you hold grudges, the person you weigh down most is yourself. The anger settles in, replaying the same story again and again, while the other person may not even be aware. Mercy sets you free. To show mercy is to release someone from the debt you feel they owe you, and in that release God pours his own release and mercy into you. Consider also how mercy shapes communities. A cycle of revenge is not only personal, it often spreads outward. Families repeat patterns of anger. Neighborhoods pass conflicts down. History itself is filled with violence born out of the refusal to forgive. Yet here is Jesus saying that the merciful are the ones who will be blessed. Mercy is like a dam that holds back floodwaters of anger. It prevents destruction by choosing another way. When people live this way together, communities actually change. You can see echoes of his teaching in times when groups once divided broke the pattern with acts of forgiveness. Often those acts were costly, but the result was peace stronger than revenge ever brought. We should notice something else about mercy. It requires empathy. To give mercy, you must be willing to look at another person not only as someone who hurt you, but as someone who also carries their own brokenness. Part of mercy is choosing to see past the anger to the human being behind it. This does not mean excusing wrong, but it means recognizing that just as you need compassion, so do they. That kind of empathy is what God shows us, and he calls us to share it with each other. Have you ever wondered why Jesus ties receiving mercy to giving it? It's because the two cannot be separated. If I cling tightly to my own anger and refuse to forgive, I close my heart. A closed heart cannot receive what God wants to pour in. But when I open my heart enough to release mercy, I make space to receive mercy from Him. It is not that my act earns His favor, it is that mercy places me in the posture of humility where I can see and enjoy it. We see this pattern again and again in Scripture. God forgives deeply, and then He calls His people to forgive in turn. The picture is clear. We show mercy in response to mercy we have received. And the more we show it, the more we understand how much we need it ourselves. This cycle doesn't trap us, it frees us. It turns the endless loop of revenge into an endless stream of grace. No matter where you are in your faith, think about how this applies today. Who in your life still owes you an apology? Who has hurt you in ways that feel unresolved? What would it look like not to wait for repayment but to extend mercy instead? That choice might feel impossible, but remember, mercy is not something we force out of ourselves. It flows from knowing we are forgiven. When you grasp that God's mercy covers you, it becomes possible, even natural, to give it away. Mercy also builds strength in your own heart. Many think forgiveness is weak, that letting someone off the hook means they win. In reality, bitterness keeps you tied to their actions. Mercy breaks the chain. In that sense, mercy is not weakness. It is strength, choosing not to let harm define the future. It is courage to step into freedom rather than staying bound to the past. When Jesus calls the merciful blessed, He is pointing to this deeper truth. He is saying, the people who give mercy will live as those who receive mercy. That is not just a comfort for the future, it changes how we live today. The more mercy flows through you, the more freedom and peace you experience with God. So take this with you today. Mercy is more than a moment, it is a way of life. It is the steady choice to answer pain with compassion and to meet wrong with kindness. It is not something reserved for saints, it is for anyone willing to step into God's kingdom rhythm of grace given and grace received. And as you walk in that rhythm, you discover blessing both now and ahead. Mercy prepares the heart for purity. When you let mercy flow, it clears bitterness away and leaves space inside. That space, open to God, becomes the ground for the next blessing Jesus describes, the blessing of a heart made pure, with eyes clear enough to see God Himself. Why does Jesus connect inner purity with actually seeing God? At first, that phrasing might sound mysterious, but it is deeply practical. The Beatitudes says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Purity here isn't focused on spotless behavior or a flawless record. Instead, it points to something more personal, a heart that is undivided, one that isn't torn between competing loves but directed towards God with honesty and clarity. That is why Jesus ties purity to vision. The more your heart is clear and free of divided loyalties, the more your eyes are open to God's presence. The result is that you see life differently, you sense God more deeply, and you begin to notice what may have been hidden in plain sight all along. Let's take a moment to reflect on how people often mistake purity. Many think of it as simply doing everything right, never making mistakes, keeping all the rules. While good actions are important, Jesus' focus digs deeper. You can do the right things outwardly and still carry a divided heart within. You can follow rituals and yet hold bitterness, chase recognition, or hide desires that compete with God's ways. Purity of heart means something more. It means living with integrity, where inward motives line up with outward actions, and where your devotion isn't split between God and other pursuits. This is not about perfection in the sense of never failing. It is about direction, the orientation of the heart. The struggle, though, is real. Many try to live with one foot in God's kingdom and the other in the world. We want God's promises, but we also want the comfort of control, the approval of others, or the safety of material things. These divided loyalties blur our vision. It's like having smudges on a pair of glasses. You can still see, but everything looks unclear. The more you wipe away the smudges, the clearer the world becomes. That's what purity of heart does. It removes what clouds our spiritual vision so that we can honestly see what is true. Imagine a man who spent years pursuing two different identities. On Sunday, he looked faithful, quoting scripture and serving in church, but during the week he lived only for money and status, spending all his time proving his worth. Eventually, he realized the conflict inside was exhausting him. He didn't feel peace because his life was divided into compartments. He decided to face the truth and let God have all of him, even the hidden parts. Slowly, his priorities shifted. He began making decisions that matched his faith, not just his ambition. Those changes weren't instant, but they gave him a new freedom. He said he felt like he could finally see, as if a fog lifted. That is what Jesus promises. The pure in heart will see God, not only in eternity, but even now, with clearer perspective. Have you ever wondered why we sometimes miss God's presence in daily life? Often it's not because he is absent, but because our hearts are distracted or divided. We can fill our minds with so much noise that we stop noticing. Purity clears away that noise. It pulls aside the curtain of distraction, pride, or fear. It sharpens awareness so that moments of ordinary life become places where you sense God's nearness. You recognize his hand in a kind word, his care in the beauty of creation, his direction in a passage of scripture, or his strength in a moment you thought you couldn't endure. This reminds us that purity is about clarity. When your heart is free from competing masters, reality doesn't look the same. You no longer see yourself only through the lens of culture or comparison. You begin to see yourself as God sees you, loved, purposeful, and redeemed. You no longer look at others as rivals or obstacles. Instead, you see them as people made in God's image, and most importantly, you begin to see God himself, not just as an idea or distant power, but as present reality. That is the blessing promised here. Think of it like cleaning a window. If you have ever stood before glass that is smudged with fingerprints and dust, you know the outside view is still there, but it looks blurred. Once the glass is cleaned, the same view becomes vibrant. Nothing outside changed, but the clarity allows you to see what was already real. In the same way, purity in heart clears away the smudges of divided loyalty, and suddenly you see more fully the reality of God's presence. Purity brings freedom too. When your focus is divided, you are always pulled in two directions. You try to please people while also pleasing God. You try to cling to comfort while also longing for his kingdom. The tug of war wears you down. A pure heart releases you from that strain, because it simplifies life into one focus, seeking God first. That singleness of heart is not heavy, it is light. It protects from the constant chasing after approval or possessions, because you already know where your treasure lies. A young woman once described her own shift toward this simplicity. She had spent years shaping her life around what others expected. She dressed, spoke, and worked in ways that kept her image polished. At the same time, she still wanted to follow God. The split left her drained. One day, reading these words about the pure in heart, she realized her struggle came from trying to serve two masters. With courage, she began shedding the pressure to live for others' approval. She asked God to give her one undivided heart. The results surprised her. It wasn't that conflicts disappeared, but her perspective changed. Daily stresses no longer carried the same weight. The approval she sought came from God alone, and that anchored her. She said it gave her new vision. She could see God in places she had overlooked before. That story shows how purity isn't about building walls of rules, it's about removing walls of distraction. It is about giving God the whole heart, not half of it. And when you live that way, your spiritual eyes open. Jesus' promise is practical. You will see God. This isn't only about eternity someday, though it will be fulfilled then too. It also means your awareness comes alive in the present. Instead of seeing only struggle, you see God's strength. Instead of seeing only emptiness, you begin to notice his provision. That shift changes how you walk through life. Think about the opposite. What happens when purity is missing? Vision becomes clouded. Faith feels distant. Worship loses its power because half the heart is elsewhere. Relationships suffer because motives are mixed. This is why many people feel stuck spiritually. They try to follow God while still clinging to parts of life they won't surrender. A divided heart loses sight of God, not because he is gone, but because other pursuits get in the way. That's why Jesus places such importance on this beatitude. It's an invitation to clear vision again. Seeing God doesn't mean physical sight, it means awareness, spiritually perceiving His presence, catching His direction, recognizing His work both in your inner life and in the world around you. When your heart is pure, you notice what others may miss. You begin to understand Scripture with new depth. You sense His Spirit guiding decisions. You find that prayer feels less like talking into the air and more like conversation with someone near. All of this begins with purity, a single-hearted devotion that wipes away fog and sharpens sight. So, purity of heart is both promise and process. It is promise in that God assures a blessing, you will see Him, and it is process in that purity is something we keep pursuing. Each day brings new choices that shape whether our heart stays undivided. It is not about achieving a perfect record, but about continually returning to God with honesty, asking Him to cleanse what distracts, and setting your focus on Him again. That movement becomes the rhythm of a pure heart. Let's take this with us today. Jesus says the pure in heart are blessed, not because they have flawless behavior, but because their vision is clear enough to see God. And when you see Him, everything else looks different. Your struggles shift in light of His presence. Your decisions carry peace because His guidance becomes visible. Your joy deepens because you see His gifts, not just the burdens. That is why purity matters so much. It is not about restriction. It is about freedom to see reality as God shows it. In their time, the crowd on the hillside needed this encouragement. They lived under rule, oppression, and pressure from leaders to present outward holiness. Many of them likely felt unworthy because they couldn't measure up to the religious performance demanded of them. Yet Jesus spoke these words to tell them it was not external perfection that blessed them. It was purity of heart, the undivided spirit that turns toward God. And in that moment, those who thought they were unworthy could stand tall, knowing they too could see God. With a pure heart, life looks different because we see differently. We see God where others see emptiness. We see His hand where others see chaos. And from that clear vision comes the courage to live in ways that reflect Him. Which raises the next question. If purity changes how we see, what happens when that vision leads us out into the world? That's where Jesus turns next, to those who make peace in places of conflict. How can bringing peace be more powerful than waging war? On the surface, peace may not look like power. Fighting feels active, raising your voice or striking back feels strong. Peace can seem softer, almost weak. But Jesus calls the peacemakers blessed, promising they will be called children of God. In other words, when you bring peace, you reflect God's own character in a broken world. That makes peace not the absence of conflict, but the active presence of God's wholeness. Peace is about restoration, not avoidance. It's about more than silence. It's about healing what is broken and mending what is divided. Let's take a moment to reflect on what peace really means. We tend to think of peace as quiet, the end of fighting, or simply getting along. But the peace that Jesus talks about runs deeper. The Bible often speaks of peace with the word shalom. Shalom points to completeness, wholeness, and life flourishing the way God designed. It is not just about avoiding harm, but about building good. So when He speaks blessing over peacemakers, He is pointing to people who don't just avoid trouble, but step into hard places to bring God's wholeness where it's missing. That is not easy work. Our natural instinct is often the opposite. When conflict rises, whether in families, schools, or even between nations, the pull is to defend, divide, and conquer. Small arguments can become long grudges. A single hurt word can spiral into years of silence. Think about how quickly a disagreement at home can grow louder until one person walks out, slamming the door. Imagine how a disagreement between groups can break into violence that lasts for generations. Escalation feels natural, but Jesus teaches that the blessed ones are those who interrupt that spiral. Let's make this real through a story. There was once a small town divided by two groups who had lived with tension for decades. Old hurts had been passed down, and mistrust sat deep. A few leaders from both sides decided they didn't want to pass the same conflict on to their children. They began meeting quietly, sharing meals together, and listening to each other's stories. At first nothing seemed to change. Old suspicion still lingered, but as they kept meeting, slowly, hearts softened. Over time, these gatherings spread to others in the town. The community began to cooperate again, sharing schools and working side by side. That kind of shift didn't erase every problem, but it broke a cycle. Peace came not through ignoring conflict, but through actively building trust where there had only been fear. This is the kind of courage Jesus celebrates. To make peace is not to hide. It is to walk directly into places of division and begin building bridges. That may mean forgiving when it is costly. It may mean listening when every instinct pushes you to argue. It may mean refusing to pass down resentment to the next generation, even if bitterness feels deserved. These decisions do not come easily, but that's the point. Peacemaking is not passive. It is one of the boldest choices a person can make. Have you ever wondered why Jesus connects peacemaking with being called God's children? Children carry the traits of their parents. They are recognized as belonging to their family. In the same way, when people see someone making peace, they are glimpsing the family resemblance of God. He is a reconciler. He brings people back to himself. So when his people work to bring peace, they mirror his heart. The world notices. It sees that these are not just ordinary actions. They reflect a divine character. To be peacemakers is to be recognized as his children. This reminds us that peace is one of the markers of Christian discipleship. The road of following Jesus is not about gaining control or about defeating people, but about living in ways that reveal his compassion. For centuries, people have admired these words in the Sermon on the Mount. They are not just personal advice, but a blueprint for life in his kingdom. In fact, his teaching on peace has inspired many who worked for change in history, not by force, but by nonviolent action. Their strength was not in weapons, but in courage shaped by Jesus' words. That shows how powerful peacemaking can be. Now let's bring this closer. One of the hardest spaces to practice peacemaking is in relationships we already have. Think about the family member you avoid calling. Think about the friend you no longer talk to because of one harsh conversation that never got worked out. These situations don't always need big speeches. Sometimes they need small acts. Sending the first message, admitting your part, being willing to listen. Each of those moments takes humility, but each opens the door for peace to grow. We also see this in workplaces or schools. Maybe two people constantly disagree and tension fills the room. A peacemaker doesn't fuel the fight, even when it's tempting. A peacemaker isn't just silent either. They may step in, invite calm, or create space for understanding. They look for ways to turn down the heat instead of turning it higher. That choice may not always fix everything, but it interrupts the natural spiral into greater harm. Notice that Jesus speaks of peacemakers, not just peaceful people. The blessing is not only for those who feel peace within themselves, valuable as that is. The blessing is tied to action, choosing to actively create peace around you. You don't have to be loud to make peace. You don't need public power positions. Most often, peacemaking begins quietly, through small steps of kindness, forgiveness, and courage. Every time you stop a conflict before it spreads, you bring God's presence into that moment. It's important to make a distinction here. Being a peacemaker does not mean ignoring unfairness or pretending harm didn't happen. True peace never comes at the cost of covering up truth. Real peacemakers name what is wrong, but they do it with the aim of healing, not hurting. They tackle problems in a way that preserves life and dignity instead of destroying. That is why making peace often takes more strength than fighting. It requires patience, honesty, and a refusal to let anger drive your choices. Have you ever noticed how peace spreads? When one person refuses to fight back, it changes the room. You can feel the shift. Anger bumps into calm and loses some of its power. That is what happens in homes and communities when peacemakers step into the story. Loss and division become chances for connection. Suspicion becomes exchanged with trust. Anger gives way, even slowly, to forgiveness. The presence of God is revealed in those shifts. Peacemakers literally carry His presence into broken places. Take this with you today. You may not be able to solve global conflicts, but you can carry His peace into your corner of the world. Start with where you are. In conversations at home, at work, or in your community, ask yourself, am I adding fuel to conflict, or am I willing to be a maker of peace? When you choose the latter, you mirror God's heart. You show the world whose child you are. How can suffering for faith ever lead to blessing? For most of us, the word blessing brings to mind joy, peace, or provision, not opposition, not rejection, and certainly not persecution. Yet in his final beatitude, Jesus names persecution not as defeat, but as a mark of his kingdom. He closed his blessings on the hillside with words that startled his hearers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Those words sound upside down, but they are rooted in a kingdom logic that turns suffering into a sign of faithfulness. Let's take a moment to reflect on why these words matter so much. Jesus could have ended the list of blessings on peace, a note that would have left the crowd comforted and inspired. But instead he went further, acknowledging what his followers would face in the real world. He named the possibility that loyalty to him would not always lead to applause or welcome. It would sometimes lead to rejection, misunderstanding, and suffering. That honesty tells us something about his message. It was not about avoiding cost, but about living truly, even when the cost is high. Persecution is not an easy subject to think about. It feels unfair, and it makes us wonder if we have failed. We tend to view rejection as a sign we did something wrong. If people criticize, if doors close, if ridicule comes, the instinct is to assume we missed the mark or lost our place. But Jesus flips that idea around. He says persecution can actually be a sign that you are standing with him, that your life aligns with a kingdom that does not fit easily with the world's values. In his words, suffering for righteousness is not failure, it is faithfulness. Think about the first listeners on that Galilean hillside. Many of them already knew what it was like to be overlooked or treated unfairly. They lived under authorities who taxed heavily and soldiers who demanded obedience. Some had probably been judged by religious leaders for not living up to standards they could never meet. To those people, Jesus offered both realism and reassurance. He told them to expect insult and opposition, but he also told them that the kingdom would be theirs. Theirs, not in spite of persecution, but right in the middle of it. This pattern has repeated across history. Followers of Jesus have often found themselves at odds with the powers of their day. Some were mocked, others were imprisoned, some even gave their lives. And yet again and again we hear testimonies of peace and courage in the middle of that pressure. Faithful people found strength that did not make sense by natural standards. Their hope was not grounded in what they could hold on to in this life, but in the reward Jesus promised, a heavenly reward outweighing the losses of earth. Consider a modern example. In recent years, there have been communities of believers who continue worshiping even under threat. In some places, meeting openly can cost jobs, safety, or even freedom. Still, these groups gather quietly, praying, singing, sharing scripture, and encouraging one another. Their faith amazes us because it shows the depth of conviction these words stirred on that mountainside long ago. For them, persecution is not a signal to abandon faith. It is part of the cost of belonging to a kingdom worth everything. And in their perseverance, they stand in the same line as the prophets Jesus mentioned, those who spoke truth despite opposition and bore witness to God's character in their day. This reminds us that persecution marks alignment with God's kingdom. If the values of the kingdom are humility, mercy, purity, and peace, then living them out will sometimes push against the flow of culture. People may not understand why you choose forgiveness instead of revenge, or generosity instead of self-protection, or purity instead of compromise. Those choices can expose values that run opposite to the world's, and sometimes people respond with rejection. That rejection, Jesus tells us, is not a curse. It is confirmation that you are walking in His way. It's important to notice what kind of persecution Jesus speaks of. He talks about insult, false accusations, and harm because of me. He is not blessing hardship that comes from unwise choices or unnecessary offense. He is blessing the endurance of those who suffer directly because of loyalty to Him. This distinction matters. It means the blessing is not about glorifying pain for its own sake, but about naming the cost that comes from genuine faith. Pain without purpose does not bless, but pain tied to alignment with Jesus carries the promise of eternal joy. Let's imagine persecution in a smaller scale many of us can relate to. Maybe it isn't life-threatening, but perhaps you faced ridicule for being honest when others cut corners. Maybe friends laugh at you for holding on to your convictions about relationships, honesty, or purity. Maybe you've been labeled narrow-minded for believing Jesus' words in a culture that celebrates self above all. Those moments can sting. They can feel like rejection, but Jesus reframes them. He says that when you face insult or false accusation on His account, you are not outside His blessing, you are inside it. Think for a moment about how this might change your perspective today. If you find yourself fearing rejection, remember His words, you are not outside His blessing. If others misunderstand you for standing with Christ, remember you are in the company of prophets and faithful witnesses throughout history. If you feel weary from criticism, remember His promise, it is not wasted. Every insult, every loss, every act of endurance is seen by God, and it carries weight in eternity. This blessing reframes how we understand suffering. Instead of seeing persecution as a sign of weakness or failure, we begin to see it as part of the road that leads to life. The road is narrow, Jesus said so, but it is also the road where His presence is most clear. The road ends not in despair, but in resilience and in eternal joy. For the persecuted, theirs is the kingdom, not just ahead, but now. They walk with God's presence in the present, and hold His promise for the future. No matter where you are in your own journey, these words invite you to consider the cost and the promise. They do not sugarcoat the reality that following Jesus may bring hard days, but they remind you those hard days are not wasted. They are honored, they are seen, they are blessed, and they lead to joy that cannot be taken away, because it rests in a kingdom that cannot be shaken. As we step back from this final beatitude, it is worth noticing how all the traits fit together: humility, grief, meekness, hunger for righteousness, mercy, purity, peace, and persecution. They form a portrait of life turned upside down. Each one builds on the last until the picture of kingdom life is complete. They are not random pieces. They are a progression, an inside-out transformation. So now we step back and ask, how do all these traits together shape a new vision of blessedness? Each beatitude is like a step, guiding us from admitting our need before God to standing firm when faith is tested. Together they form not just private reflection, but a way of living that shows the kingdom of God openly. This reminds us that true strength is not found in high positions or loud voices, but in humility, mercy, and trust that God holds the final word. So let me leave you with this. Which beatitude speaks most to you right now? And how might living it reshape the way you see your life, your struggles, and your hope?